Hello, class. As seems frequently to be the case in coronavirus tide, I have had to pivot this morning. Very stressful. When I first tried to go live, it wouldn't work. And so I'm having to recreate a new link and put it up on Canvas. I hope that this works. I think that it will. One sec. I've never had internet problems at my house until this morning. At the beginning of the pandemic, I installed a new internet system, Google Nest, throughout my entire house for this very reason. But this morning there was a hiccup. Okay, this should work. I just put the new link on Canvas, and I expect that folks will be joining momentarily. It is partly my fault. I lost track of time. I'm an early riser. I've had a great morning, but I looked up at the watch and it was like 7:56, and I realized, oh my gosh, I have class in 4 minutes, so I had to scramble. But I'm hoping that people will start joining the class momentarily. Good morning. Good morning. I see that people are beginning to join. That's good. I'm going to wait until there's about 15 or 20 people online to begin. Hello, Jocelyn. Nice to see you. Sorry about the hiccup this morning. I'm hoping to see at least 15 folks join. Regardless, I will be putting this on my YouTube channel so that folks can look at it afterward if they're unable to join us this morning. Good morning. We've got 4 people online at the moment. Hi, hello, friends. I think it's okay to say your names. I think it's okay to say first names online, so that's what I will do. Hello, Jocelyn, Rebecca, and Adan. Welcome, class. Good morning. Sorry about the hiccup. We're running about 10 minutes late, but no worries. I will have you out of here no later than 9:15, okay? Good morning. We've got 6 folks. Good morning, Andrea. Great to see you. Y'all, I feel fine about saying first names online, but no last names. Sound okay? Good morning. Good to see everyone. We've got 8 folks online with me now, so I'm going to wait for a couple more and then we will get started. I'm an Episcopal priest, and so I find myself wanting to pray at the beginning of class, especially because I care for you guys and it's a difficult time. But I'm obviously not going to do that. So instead of prayer, we have a little ritual, and the ritual is this. I'm typing it in. May the force be with you. That's our little ritual. It's kind of my substitute for a prayer. When I get one more person online, we will get started. Great to see everyone. I'm going to get started in about very shortly. I lost someone. Okay, someone's back. Good morning. It seems like there's a slight delay in the feed, but that's okay. When I get one more person online, we're just going to start. I'm sorry that we're running a little bit late today and I don't have my watch. Okay, y'all, we're just going to get started. It's good to see everyone. And my hope is that that y'all will use the chat feature and that we can have a good conversation that way. Okay. We are looking at Plato's Apology today. We have spent the last few classes introducing Plato. We read and discussed the beginning dialogue, the Euthyphro, which in my opinion and the opinion of many Plato scholars is kind of like the best dialogue to begin with, to cut your teeth on Plato with. But today we're moving on to the Apology, which is a little bit longer than the Euthyphro. It's a little bit more involved. But as I've tried to say, the Euthyphro and the Apology, as well as these three other dialogues that we are not reading in our class, the Euthyphro and the Apology are stitched together in a larger plot, a larger dramatic movement that Plato is writing. Remember, Plato doesn't write systematically like Aristotle does. Plato writes in the form of stories or dramatic dialogues. So we're going to get started with the Apology today. I did give y'all a link to my notes, my lecture notes, which are on my Google Drive. I hope that that's okay for me to do. That's what I did, and I encourage y'all to look at those. I'm going to be trying to stick closely today to those lecture notes. Yeah, it actually says, let's see here. Yeah, I'm going to try to stick closely to those lecture notes. It actually says Tuesday, 9/22. But I'm going to be talking about Plato's Apology. No, it says Thursday, 9/24 YouTube live stream. Perfect. It says Apology lecture. I'm lecturing on the Apology this morning, and I'm going to stick pretty closely to these notes. So I do encourage you to follow along, whether you're with me live this morning or watching this video ex post facto, after the fact. Okay. We've already talked about the name of the dialogue. We've already talked about what the word apology means for someone like Plato, or indeed someone like Peter. We talked about how Peter, I don't remember the chapter and verse, but St. Peter says, always be ready to make a defense for the hope that is in you. And we talked about the meaning of that word apology. Who can remind me on the chat? Who can remind me what the word apology does not mean? What does the word apology not mean? Apologia in Greek and I think in Latin. What does the word apology not mean? That's right, Macy. It does not mean saying sorry. That's exactly right. And instead, what Plato is getting at, and indeed what Peter is getting at, is this idea of defense. So as we saw on our quiz, the setting, the larger context of the Euthyphro and also the Apology is a legal setting. Socrates is making a defense. He's defending himself against certain charges that are being brought against him in something like a court of law. In the introduction to the Apology, on page 21 in my copy of the book, on page 21, there's a good sort of introduction to the work, and I think that that's really good. The author, it's probably written by Grube. The author mentions that in these courts of law in ancient Athens, like the ones that Socrates was in, there would have been 501 members of the court, 501 free men. Sorry, ladies. If you were female, you weren't considered a full citizen of the polis of Athens, and the same is true as if you were a slave. Now, keep in mind that slavery in the ancient world was not was quite different from the way that you and I, as Americans, think about slavery. It wasn't primarily race-based. Nevertheless, there were slaves, there were females, and you had to be not a slave, not a female, in order to be a fully free Athenian citizen with all the rights and privileges going along with that, including the opportunity to serve in a court of law. So there were 501 free men, and that is the audience to whom Socrates is giving his defense. Okay? We already talked about that. Let's move on. I'm on my outline. Let's move on to Roman numeral 2. I wanted to just mention that Socrates draws attention to his manner of speaking. Socrates draws attention to his manner of speaking. And I think that that's interesting just because here we see yet another link up. We see yet another link up with what's going on in Plato's dialogues on the one hand versus what we find in that ancient text of the New Testament on the other. In other words, Socrates seems kind of like a writer of the New Testament here, because who is it in the New Testament that draws attention to his style of writing? It's St. Paul. St. Paul, who wrote several letters in the New Testament. You might even say that Paul's letters are kind of like the bulk of the New Testament after the four Gospels. But Paul, especially in books like 1 Corinthians, Paul draws attention to his manner of speaking. Side note, I'm reading an amazing book by an author named Tom Holland. It's a new book. It's called Dominion. It's been getting a lot of attention on the internet. Very good book. New book by Tom Holland called Dominion. And just the other day, I was reading his chapter 3, in which he speaks a good deal about St. Paul. And he makes the comment, it's kind of a side note comment, that Paul, how can I put this? Paul was sufficiently schooled in rhetoric to talk about how poor his rhetoric was. In other words, whenever you see Paul or Socrates talking about how they don't speak cleverly, how their language is not flowery, but it's simple and humble, that itself is kind of like a clear indication that this writer is someone who has been trained and is well-versed in rhetoric. It's kind of like an inside signal. It's kind of like a false modesty or a kind of irony. Look at how sophisticated I am. I'm going to pretend like I'm simple. If you're truly simple, you don't draw attention to the fact that you're simple. It takes a certain amount of sophistication in rhetoric and schooling and education in order even to know that you're supposed to sort of brag about how simple you are, okay? And we see that in St. Paul's letters. That's in 1 Corinthians. So in places like 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, you can see Paul saying things like, when I came to you, I did not come speaking lofty words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of the power of God, so that our faith might not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. So in that context, 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, you can see St. Paul drawing attention to his manner of speaking, which he's saying is simple and not sophisticated. And we see Socrates doing the same thing here in this dialogue. So that's a second link up between Plato on the one hand and the New Testament on the other. And I just think that that's very interesting. Moving on in the outline, let's go to Roman numeral 3. And And I want to talk with you for the next few minutes about this issue of sophistry. We've already started talking about this in the class. The way that I've tried to present it to you is in terms of opposites. So if I were to ask you what is the opposite of philosophy, the answer to that question would be sophistry. Or better yet, if I were to ask you, for an ancient philosopher like Plato or Aristotle, for someone like Plato or Aristotle, what is the opposite of philosophy? The answer would be sophistry. And we've talked about this already a little bit in this class. Let me ask you a question. We talked about how philosophy and sophistry are opposites, or they're different in two different ways. We talked about how they are different in terms of motivation and then also in terms of goal. So let me ask you a question. Does anyone remember what the motivation of a sophist is? What is the motivation of a sophist? I'm going to look at my notes and see exactly how I worded this. The motivation of a sophist is, does anyone remember? Good, financial gain. That's exactly right. The motivation of a sophist is a financial gain. What did we say the motivation of a real philosopher, someone like Socrates, is? It's sharing the truth and living the truth in community. And by the way, that communal piece is important. That's why people like Plato and Aristotle, they didn't just talk to themselves, but they wanted to learn the truth and live the truth in community. And that's why they started schools. Plato started the school of the Academy. Aristotle started a different school called the Lyceum. But the point is that these schools are community. And so you can see that Plato and Aristotle have this conviction that in order truly to live the truth, you have to live it out in community. But yeah, the motivation for the sophist is financial gain. The reason why a teacher of sophistry wants to get more and more students is to make more and more money. And that's the motivation, the motivational difference between the sophists on the one hand and the true philosophers on the other. But what about the goal? Who can tell me what the goal of the sophist was? Now, Elizabeth already said it, so I'll just go ahead and spit it out. The goal of the sophist is political success. Can someone tell me what the goal of the true philosopher is? What did we say the other day? The goal of the true philosopher is simply wisdom, the love of wisdom, or you might say wisdom for its own sake. And I want to hit the pause button real quick and talk a little bit more about this difference between sophists on the one hand and real philosophers on the other. The difference really can be put like this. The true philosopher engages in his practice or in his discipline for its own sake. A true philosopher says, you know what, I want to learn the truth just because there's inherent goodness in learning the truth. It's something that you do for its own sake. But if you look at the sophists and what their goal is, their goal is actually political success, which is which is an end that is extrinsic to the means. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that for the sophists, they're putting down something that is a means to some other end. And you can put it like this. The sophists in this way are utilitarian. They are trying to give people skills so that they can achieve some other outcome. And the other outcome in this case is political success. And that's an important difference that we're going to come back to over and over in this class. If you want to begin to wrap your mind about some of the most important themes in ancient and pre-modern philosophy, this is one of them. This distinction between doing something for its own sake just because it's inherently good versus doing something as a means to some other end. And by the way, if you do something for its own sake, that's closely related to the idea that the purpose of an activity is included in the activity itself. In other words, the purpose of the activity is not some external end or some external purpose, but rather it's packed in. It's included in the activity itself. And the stock example that I've used in class is yoga. If someone does yoga because they want to lose weight, or if someone does yoga because they want to post pictures of themselves on Instagram so they can look cool, that is doing yoga for a reason or a goal or a purpose other than the activity itself. The reason they're doing yoga is because they want to post something. The reason they're doing yoga is because they want to lose weight. The reason they're doing yoga is because they want to be able to fit into their dress size that they can no longer fit into because they've gained weight. All of that is doing yoga for an external reason. But show me someone who does yoga for its own sake. Show me someone who does yoga just because it's good to do yoga, or just because when they do yoga, they find that their well-being is enhanced. That is someone who's doing yoga for its own sake. And y'all, you can say similar things about things like prayer. Show me someone who prays because they want their daughter to be to have a good day at school. Show me someone who prays because they want their grandmother to be cured of her cancer. I will show you someone who's praying as a means to some other end, and the end or the goal is external to the prayer itself. But show me someone who's praying or meditating or contemplating, or you could say even just worshiping God, not to achieve some outcome, but just because it's good, just because they find that whenever they pray, whenever they worship, whenever they contemplate or meditate, that they find that their well-being is enhanced. And that is someone who's doing those activities: prayer, contemplation, worship, meditation, yoga, for its own sake. And that's what I'm trying to say to you with this distinction between the philosophers on the one hand and the sophists on the other. A true philosopher, for someone like Plato or Aristotle, is someone who engages in activity not for some external means, not to become a millionaire or a billionaire, not to become famous, not to be able to leave their children and grandchildren a big inheritance. No, but they do activities for their own sake. Yeah. And if we had more time, I could connect this to the notion of education. Whenever the university as a Western cultural institution was started by Christians in the medieval times, basically like the 12th century, in places like Paris and Oxford, those universities were not established so that people could have good careers. The purpose of the university, whenever the university was started, was not so that people could make lots of money whenever they graduate. No, the purpose of education was to learn the truth, to grow as a human being, to learn how to find communion with God. These are activities that are good for their own sake. And I'm just going to say one more thing about this, which is kind of like a preview for Aristotle. If you want a label or a term for this human activity that is done for its own sake, the term that Aristotle gives us is the term eudaimonia. And I'm going to write that in the comments, in the chat. Aristotle's term for the ultimate human activity, which is done for its own sake, is, and I'm simplifying a little bit, but still, it's okay. Is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. This term for Aristotle is closely related to the notion of contemplation. Okay? There you go. Aristotle's term for the ultimate human activity which is done for its own sake is eudaimonia. eudaimonia, eudaimonia. This term for Aristotle is closely related to the notion of contemplation. What Aristotle thinks is that the highest activity of the human being is not building a house. It's not doing push-ups. It's not learning your multiplication tables. It's not running for Congress. It's not making love to your wife. No, for Aristotle, those are all good. But for Aristotle, the highest activity of the human being is contemplation. And what he says is that when one learns to contemplate, one achieves or one can achieve eudaimonia. What is eudaimonia? Eudaimonia is often translated happiness. Sometimes it's translated as success. I think that the best translation for that word eudaimonia is probably well-being. You might think of it as holistic well-being. But see, let's bring it back to the apology and the discussion that we find in the apology between the sophists and the philosophers. The basic idea is that a philosopher is someone who does something for its own sake, not to make money, not to train students to get elected to office. No, but to become wise, to do something for its own sake, to do something just because it leads to a better life. Okay, that's the idea. And this is what I think Plato is getting at with this distinction between the sophists on the one hand and the true philosopher on the other. The last thing I just want to remind you of or say or underline is, you know, it's interesting that I, in the midst of this discussion on Plato's apology, I've talked at length about Aristotle. Why have I done that? I've done that because Plato and Aristotle are very, very similar. Do they have some differences? Yes, they do. But the big themes, and especially for an intro to philosophy class like this, the big themes that you find in Aristotle, they're all in Plato, and he got them from Plato. So you can see a big overlap between Plato and Aristotle with this notion of doing something for its own sake, as opposed to doing something as a means to some other end. And let me just remind you real quick that for Aristotle, the three forms of the good are utility at the bottom, pleasure, which is better than utility. So utility and then pleasure and then beauty. Utility, pleasure, beauty. Utility is not bad. It's just that it's the lowest form of the good. Pleasure for someone like Aristotle or St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or C.S. Lewis, pleasure is better than utility, but it's not as good as beauty. The highest form of the good for someone like Plato, for someone like Aristotle, for someone like Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or C.S. Lewis, the highest form of the good is beauty, okay? That's just a little bit of review right there. And I'm going to continue on with the lecture. Actually, I need to say a few more things about this notion of doing something for its own sake. Because y'all, a minute ago when I talked about this notion of doing something for its own sake, I said that it's closely related to doing something for a purpose that is intrinsic to the activity itself. And that is different from doing an activity whose purpose is outside of itself, right? So if I build a treehouse, if I pick up a hammer and nail nails, I'm not nailing those nails just because it's good to nail nails. No, I'm nailing nails in order to make a treehouse. Well, that treehouse is a goal which is extrinsic to the activity of nailing nails itself. What I want to say to you right now is that the Greek word for goal in that sense is the word telos, T-E-L-O-S. I'm going to put that in the chat. Telos, T-E-L-O-S. And I want to say just a few things, and these are in my notes, just a few things about this notion of telos before we go on. And the way I want to word this is I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question, and it's a complicated question. I don't really expect you to sort of have an answer to this question or even to know how to think about it, but I'm still going to throw it out there for didactic or heuristic or rhetorical purpose. Okay. And the question is, in your opinion, is there such a thing as an objective human nature? The question is, I'm going to write this in the chat. Is there such a thing as an objective human nature? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is something like this. If you think about a hammer or a watch, again, I don't have my watch, which is frustrating to me. But if you think about a hammer or a watch, those have objective natures. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that it is the purpose of a watch to tell time. It's the purpose of a watch to tell time. What is the purpose of a hammer? The purpose of a hammer is to nail nails, right? Now, is it possible that someone could use a watch to nail nails? Y'all, I'm going to go get my watch real quick. Please hang on. Is it possible that I can use my watch to sort of nail nails? Imagine that I'm building a treehouse for my daughter and I'm using my watch and I'm going to nail nails with it. Is that possible? You know, it might be possible, but it would be stupid, right? And the reason it would be stupid is because that is not the purpose of a watch. The purpose of a watch is to tell time. Now, you can pretend like the purpose of a watch is to nail nails. And you know what? You might actually be able to get one nail halfway into the wood, okay? However, the purpose of a watch is not to nail nails. And by the way, the purpose of a hammer is not to tell time. You can pretend like the purpose of a hammer is to tell time, but it's just not. The purpose of a hammer is not to tell time. The question is, okay, and let me put it like this. There is an objective nature to a watch. There's an objective nature to a hammer. The question is there an objective nature to the human being? Or is the human person, is the nature, the essence, the purpose of a human being, is that something that you can make up? This question is closely related to the idea of creating your own identity. Like we live in a world where it's fashionable and trendy to say that you can create your own identity, right? I mean, I might look like a white male, but if I decide next month that I would like to be a Latinx female or indeed a trans person, hey, I can just change my identity. Like that's a trendy notion in our culture, right? Well, that question is closely related to the question that I'm trying to ask you right now, namely, is there an objective nature to the human being? Or is human nature something that we can invent, reinvent for ourselves? That is the question, okay? And for someone like Plato or Aristotle, the answer is clear. Human beings have an objective nature. It's not the case that you can just sort of decide tomorrow that you want to be a tree or stuff like that. And you know, you and I might think that we might want to roll our eyes at that or say that Plato and Aristotle are sort of stupid. or that they're very primitive or Neanderthal, and they don't understand what we understand because, after all, we have modern science and all this kind of stuff. But before we rush to that attitude, I want to pause and get you to think about this idea that maybe they were onto something, that Plato and Aristotle were not complete idiots for saying that human beings have an objective nature. Because you see, in the Apology, and also in the Euthyphro that we looked at last time, in the Apology, Plato spends a good bit of time talking about this notion of telos. And y'all, where do we see this notion of telos? Now, that word telos, I don't think pops up in the Greek of these dialogues. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that he's talking about the notion of telos, or purpose, whenever he introduces this notion of improvement. He did this in the Euthyphro. We talked about it briefly, and he also does it in the Apology. And he does it in this discussion about sophistry, because in this discussion about sophistry, and by the way, he names the names of several sophists. He names the names of several sophists, and by the way, that's at marginal note 19E. Marginal note 19E of the Apology. Whenever we talk about ancient texts like the Apology, we don't usually refer to page numbers, because, after all, you might have a different edition of this book, or indeed you might have a completely different translation, or you might be looking at something online. And so it makes a lot more sense to talk about the marginal numbers. And so if you turn to marginal number 19E, you can find the name of several sophists. So if I'm at 19E, I see Gorgias of Leontini, Prodicus of Chaos, Hippias of Elis. Those are three names: Gorgias, Prodicus, and Hippias. And actually, at least one of Plato's dialogues is named after one of those sophists. Plato has a dialogue called Gorgias. But those are the names of three different sophists. And as Plato is talking and speaking and writing in the context of this issue of philosophy versus sophistry, we find, once again, him talking about this notion of improvement. And he's talking about improvement in the field or the discipline of animal husbandry. Whenever we were looking at the Euthyphro, we talked about this. I said that over and over again, Plato talks about animal husbandry. Why? It's this idea of improving something. If you are someone who raises horses for a living, and it may be that several of my students know what it's like to raise horses, because, after all, we live in East Texas, what you're trying to do when you raise that horse is to improve the horse. You're trying to turn a little baby horse into a mature horse, a horse that has strong legs, a horse that knows how to gallop and run. You're not trying to take that horse and improve it so that it becomes an oak tree, right? No, because an oak tree is not the nature of that horse. What you're trying to do is improve the horse. In other words, what you're trying to do is to allow that horse to reach its full potential, to reach its full purpose. You're wanting that horse to flower into full horseness, right? This is what Plato says is the goal of a teacher. So this is what he says that the sophists ought to be doing, and this is also what he says that real philosophers ought to be doing with their students, is to help those students realize their full potential, or to become actualized human beings, We're going to talk more about this notion of actuality versus potentiality when we come to Aristotle in a couple of weeks. But what Plato is saying is human beings are intended to grow up into to be fully actualized. And the metaphor that I use in my class to talk about this notion of full actuality is that of an oak tree. If you think about an acorn is small, it's kind of round, it falls into the ground, but the goal is not for the acorn to remain an acorn. The goal is for the acorn to develop into something else, to develop into a fully actualized oak tree. What is a fully actualized oak tree? It's an oak tree that has big branches. It's an oak tree that has deep roots. It's an oak tree that is strong enough for birds to come and make nests in its branches. It's an oak tree whose leaves are enabled to engage in the process of photosynthesis so that it can take in sunlight and then emit oxygen out into the world, right? All of these things are what a fully actualized oak tree is designed to be and to do. And friends, that is the purpose of an acorn. That is the telos of an acorn. If someone's job is to raise oak trees and to plant oak trees, what they're trying to do is to get that acorn to grow and develop and mature into a fully actualized oak tree with big branches, deep roots, leaves that can engage in photosynthesis. And Plato is saying that the job of a teacher is similar. It's to take children, kids, young men, adolescent boys who are 13 years old, 14 years old, and to train them to reach their full potentiality. The question is, what is their full potentiality? In other words, what is their true telos? Is it just to become a successful political leader, or is it to become wise? Plato and Aristotle think that the goal of a human being is to become wise and to gain wisdom, and that actually that is the objective purpose, aka the telos of the human person. And what they want to say is that that telos is objective, okay? And y'all, another like an analogy for this, and I'm on my outline, I'm on Roman numeral 3 at number 3 beneath it, where it says Westminster Shorter Catechism. An analogy for this way of thinking comes several centuries later in the 16th century in something called the Westminster Shorter Catechism. A catechism is a series of questions and answers about the Christian faith. And the Westminster Shorter Catechism asks this question: what is the chief end of man? I'm going to write that in the comments. What is the chief end of man? Which is closely related to saying, what is the main purpose of a human being, right? What is the main purpose of a human being? This is Westminster Shorter Catechism, question and answer 1. But you see, whenever the Westminster divines, those are the people who wrote the Westminster Catechism, whenever the Westminster divines ask that question, what is the chief end of man? What is the main purpose of the human being? They were asking the question, what is the telos of the human person? What is the reason human beings exist? By the way, their answer was to glorify God and to enjoy God forever. I want you to think about that. The answer to this question, what is the main purpose of the human being, is not to make a bunch of money. The answer to this question, what is the main purpose of the human being, is not to raise children who can then have other children or who can then become successful business people. No. The chief end of man, the main purpose of human beings, the reason why you exist, according to the Westminster divines. But I got to tell you that the opinion of Plato and Aristotle, C.S. Lewis, Thomas Aquinas, and Augustine is not that much different. The reason you exist is to enjoy God. I want you to see how enjoying God is not a means to some other end. No, it's an activity that's done for its own sake. It's closely related to things like prayer, worship. To use the language of Aristotle, it's the language of contemplation. But this is an activity that is done for its own sake, which is another way of saying it's an activity in which the goal or the telos is inherent to the activity itself, okay? So I'm trying to emphasize this distinction between an activity that's done for its own sake on the one hand versus a utilitarian activity on the other. A utilitarian activity in which the activity is done for the sake of some goal, some end, which is extrinsic, which is outside of the activity itself, okay? For people like Plato and Aristotle, the goal of the human life is intrinsic to the activity itself. It's not utilitarian. We don't exist to make money. We don't exist to be good Americans who can conquer the world. We don't exist to further modern science. We don't exist to discover some scientific breakthrough. No, we exist for contemplation. We exist to enjoy God. We exist, here's one way to say it. We exist to find intimate communion with being itself. That's how I'm going to put it for today's class. Y'all, it's 8:50. I'm going to talk for about 20 more minutes. Look with me at number 4 on the outline under Roman numeral 3. What Socrates was trying to do as a philosopher training his students was to show them how to do that. In other words, contemplation. In other words, how to achieve eudaimonia. In other words, how to be wise. He was trying to show them how to do that or something similar, how to be fully human, how to live into one's telos. And all of this presupposes that human beings actually do have an objective purpose, that human beings do have an objective nature. And that's what Plato and Aristotle think. Now, I want to say one little thing before we move on. I hope that you find this interesting. I hope that I'm making sense. I hope that you're able to grab onto what I'm talking about and make sense of it. I want to say one more thing, and this is a comment that is kind of in opposition to Plato and Aristotle. What I'm about to say makes me sort of a modern person. It makes me, you might say, an existentialist type of thinker, but I also think that you can find this kind of thinking in St. Augustine. Here is an argument against saying that human beings have an objective nature, although the argument that I'm going to make right now is also conservative and traditional and deeply Christian. You might want to argue that the purpose of human beings or the nature of the human person includes the idea of freedom, okay? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that yes, Aristotle, it's true that the nature of the human person, that the purpose of the human being is eudaimonia, this notion of well-being that you talk about. Okay, that's a good point, Aristotle. High five. But you also need to understand that human beings have freedom, that part of what it means to be essentially human is to have freedom, freedom to make your own decisions, freedom to love someone or not to love someone, all sorts of decisions in your life that involve freedom. And if that's true, then there is some truth to the idea that human beings are able to create their own reality. Yes, it may be true that my ultimate purpose is to enjoy God, to contemplate, to achieve that kind of holistic well-being that Aristotle talks about. Yeah, all of that is true, but how do we do it? Part of the way we do it involves freedom, and what that means is that it's at least possible that the objective nature of this person is not identical to the objective purpose of this person. And so you see, I think that with the notion of human freedom, that's something that Plato and Aristotle didn't really talk a whole lot about. And they seem to sort of overlook that when it comes to this notion of the essential purpose or nature of the human person. Okay. I'm going to move on. I want to move on to a next theme, and this is on my outline, Roman numeral 4. I'm talking here about the origin of Socrates' reputation. Because, y'all, what was the reputation of Socrates? Socrates had a reputation of being super wise, right? Remember that the word Sophia in Greek, which I'm going to write in the chat, the word Sophia means wisdom. And Socrates had this reputation around the city of Athens for being a wise person. Now, some people got irritated by this. Some people thought that Socrates was stupid or arrogant, and they wanted to destroy him. That's true. But nevertheless, he had this reputation for wisdom, and he talks about this in the course of the Apology. And I wanted to just draw your attention to that. How did Socrates get this reputation for wisdom? And so the answer to this question is given in the dialogue itself. Socrates basically tells a story. He tells an autobiographical story that involves the Oracle of Delphi, but it also involves a friend of his named Charaphon, right? Charaphon. And he talks about how Charaphon went to the Oracle of Delphi, and I was going to show you a video of the Oracle of Delphi, but I'm not able to do that because I don't know how to do it on YouTube live. Probably in the next lecture, I'm going to start doing live Zoom meetings and then upload those to YouTube. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I can have slides in my presentation, and within those slides, I can put YouTube videos. But the point is that Socrates tells this story about his friend Charaphon, and basically Charaphon goes to the Oracle of Delphi and basically says, "Hey, Oracle, who's the wisest person in the world?" And basically the Oracle of Delphi says, "There's no one in the world who is wiser than Socrates. There's no one in the world who is wiser than Socrates." And so Socrates hears this from his friend Charaphon, and he's like, "What? I'm not wise. I don't know anything. I'm an ignorant person. I feel like I don't know anything." So what Socrates decides to do is to go around the city of Athens, and he begins to interrogate people. He walks around the city of Athens and he begins to have conversations with people, and he begins to just ask them questions that any wise person surely should know the answer to. So, for example, he walks up to politicians and asks the question, "What is justice?" Right? You'd think that if someone has given their lives to the political sphere, they ought to be able to answer the question, "What is justice?" And so Socrates walks up to the politicians and simply asks them. What happens next is kind of amazing, and it shocks Socrates because lo and behold, none of the politicians that Socrates interrogates are able to answer the question. Socrates walks up to the politicians and says, "What is justice?" And it turns out that the answers that he gets in response are foolish. And so Socrates is shocked. He's shocked by the fact that the politicians do not know how to give an account for justice that makes any sense. And he's flabbergasted by this. But y'all, he doesn't just end with the politicians. There's two other groups of people in the city of Athens that Socrates interrogates and cross-examines and engages in dialogue with. It's not just the politicians, but it's also the poets and the craftsmen. These are the three different groups of people that Socrates walks around the city of Athens and cross-examines. And y'all, this would be a great question for a quiz or a final exam. Who are the three types of people that Socrates engages with and interrogates in the city of Athens? Number one, the politicians. Number two, the poets. And number three, the craftsmen. But in every case, it turns out that they don't know how to answer his questions. Side note, it turns out that the craftsmen are the wisest. It turns out that the craftsmen are the ones who they're not able to sort of answer the questions perfectly, but at least they do better than the politicians and the poets, and especially the politicians. You can tell that Socrates is not a huge fan of politics. At least that's true on the surface of things. And so it turns out that the wisest people out of these three are sort of like the lowest level, the least sophisticated, the least educated, the least arrogant, the simple craftsmen. It turns out that they are less full of shit than the other people. And that's an interesting thing that I wish we had more time to talk about. But who are the three people that Socrates cross-examines on the streets of Athens? Number one, the politicians. Number two, the poets. And number three, the craftsmen. But it turns out that none of them know what they're talking about. None of them have knowledge. None of them have wisdom, But the problem is that they think they do. So what is it that makes Socrates wise? It turns out that the thing that makes Socrates so wise is that at least he doesn't pretend to have wisdom. In other words, Socrates learns over time in dialogue with all of these people. What he learns is that, oh my gosh, the problem with these people and the reason why they are foolish is because they claim to have knowledge and wisdom, but they actually don't. And so it turns out that Socrates, what makes him wise is that he says, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything at all. The only thing I know is that I don't know anything at all. And y'all, that is often called Socratic irony, right? Because a lot of people think that actually, if you ask the question, does Socrates know anything? Actually, he does. He just sort of claims that he doesn't. That's kind of true in some sense. But what's also true is that Socrates says, hey, at least I don't claim to have knowledge. At least I don't claim to have wisdom. And that is the problem with all of these other groups. They claim to know stuff when in reality, they're full of shit. And so that is what makes Socrates wise. That it turns out that that's what the Oracle of Delphi was talking about. It turns out that this is why there's no one in Athens or perhaps even in the whole world who is wiser than Socrates, because at least Socrates doesn't claim to know things that he doesn't know. And y'all, I think I'm going to end the class right there because I have to be downtown in about 20 minutes. I'm going to end the class right there, and we're going to start up in the next class talking about knowing and knowing that you know, and also not knowing and not knowing that you don't know. In other words, we're going to talk about known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. We're going to pick up with that at the next class. And I will see you guys on Tuesday. May the force be with you.